a few weeks ago, I heard a misstatement. This week, the annual cycle is reading Parshas Pinchas, and many are aware of one shot in the Gemara, because this is the one that's brought by Rashi, that Pinchas, until he killed Zimri in his act of zealotry, was not a qualified Kohen, which is kind of strange. Why? Because Pinchas's father was a Kohen and his grandfather was a Kohen. As a matter of fact, the Kahuna started with their family, and Pinchas is described as having being around even before the Exodus. Of all the sons of Aaron, Elazar is the one who actually we hear about his children. Yeah, we hear about Ithamar's children later in Tanakh. Nadav and Avihu apparently died without children. It says it explicitly. At least they died without sons. See, if they had daughters, it wouldn't pass on the kahuna. The Medrash says no. It's actually quite literal. Banim doesn't just mean male children; it means male and female children. Nadav and Avihu died completely childless, but Elazar at least had one son, and eventually he had many sons and many descendants. The majority of Kohanim descended from him by the time we get to King David's time. But when we read about Pinchas, apparently, the way Rashi has it, he follows this Talmudic opinion that because Pinchas was born before his grandfather and father had been chosen and initiated into the priesthood, he himself was not qualified. He was born before that, the grandfather clause, basically. And that says that's why now, some 38 years later, after the kahuna had started, Pinchas, through his act of sacrifice, his act of Mesiras Nefesh, had earned the kahuna. Now, this is kind of funny because this opens up the door, by the way, for perhaps then God would decree that some other great Jewish character who also succeeds where no one else has, who's able to pass a similar test of similar danger as Pinchas, would also earn kahuna. Is that right? The kahuna is supposed to be something eternal given to Aaron and his descendants, and it would be kind of strange that suddenly you'd have, let's say, a fellow who's what do you call it, a kohanic halal or a mamzer. Usually, if you have a fellow who's a mamzer and his father's a kohen, he's a type of halal. There's usually a halal overlap there. Halal is a descendant of Aaron in the male line who is not qualified to be a priest, and he can never be requalified to be a priest. But suddenly this opens up the door for saying someone who wasn't a priest until this point, at the age of 47, does an amazing act of Jewish heroism and is rewarded by God through the prophet as, congratulations, your priesthood has been reinstated. It's kind of an iffy proposition. Either way, this Talmudic opinion is brought by Rashi, and people think that this is 100%, this is the pshat in the pasuk, the unanimous pshat. I'm not saying there are those sages who do not believe that this was the pshat. It does have problems, but this is but one pshat in the pasuk. The other pshat is what? That Pinchas was always a Kohen, always qualified to be a Kohen. He was not initiated into the service when his father and uncles and grandfather were initiated many years prior, only because he was still a child at the time. But indeed, when Pinchas grew up, he was a regular Kohen, and now God was rewarding him not with basic kahuna, but the right, or at least the privilege, of being a Kohen Gadol for many generations and having a line of Kohanim Gadolim come from him. That's what God was rewarding him, but not that he suddenly became a Kohen. Why does I say this? Because there are other shatot, if we could use pshatz, a Yiddish word. How would you say that? I don't think the Rambam would use a word as upshat or opinion pshatim. I don't know. That doesn't seem to be a word even Rashi would use. By the way, there's other interpretations or understandings of Torah basics that people think are unanimous when they are not. One of those is what we have over here, the opinion of Rav Dimi in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, which is that Shilo, where the Mishkan stood for a few centuries, where basically that was the Beis Hamikdash at the time, was also in Benjamin's territory. I'd like to show you how the Yerushalmi and how the Bavli have this, and how such an idea is actually not unanimous and is actually contradicted pointed out by let's say, other great sages. This cannot be pshat because it contradicts the physical reality on the map. Sometimes you have a pshat that people don't realize is far from unanimous. Okay, so let's look into it. Where does this misunderstanding come from? Here it is. Here, this is in Tvachim on the 118th page. Kiyasu Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi. Rav Dimi came to Bavel and he said in the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, B'shlosha mikomot sharta shechina al Yisrael, b'Shilo v'Novi Givon uVeit Olamim. In Shiloh and Novin Givon and Beit Olamim. And if you can count, by the way, there's three types of people in this world: those who can count and those who cannot count. And here we apparently have the people who cannot, because I count four over here: Shiloh, Nov, and Givon, and Beit Olamim. So for some reason, Nov and Givon are considered one place where the Shekhinah settled. And the question here is why they decided to lump the two together. So look at that, their Mepharshim explain it. By the way, these were places where the divine presence revealed itself to the Jewish people. And also they asked, wait a minute, Gilgal, the first 7 or 14 years of Israel were in Eretz Yisrael, the Mishkan was at Gilgal, which is in the Jordan River Valley. So what, there was no Shekhinah there? Good question. In all those places, it was only in Benjamin's territory. Benjamin, like all the other tribes, got a territory that was expansive. There was the north part, the south part, the east part. And all of these places happen to have been in Benjamin's territory. Shneimar, Kol Faith, Alav, Kol Hayom. God, so to speak, hovers over him all day. That's Moses' blessing to Binyamin. Kol Chafifoth, Lo Yehu, Ela B'chel Kosha Binyamin. Wherever you have Chafifoth, this word, this anthropomorphic word describing God's presence, so to speak, dwelling somewhere. What? It was only in Benjamin's territory. That's what Rabbi Yonasi said. So Abaye went, when he showed up in front of Rav Yosef, this is in the 200s, he said this in front of Rav Yosef. And Rav Yosef was scandalized by such a proposition. Omar, Chad means Chailil had but one son. Rashi interprets Chailil as being Abaye's father's name. Okay? Or Kailil. I don't know what that name means, but that's what Rashi surmises. That was his name. Okay? Abaye ben Kailil. And Velo Mitkan, and he's not proper. He's not, imperfect. He was so upset by Abaye saying such a thing, because this seems like outlandish to say that the Shekhinah only revealed itself, or that the sanctuaries only stood in Benjamin's territory. V'hakativ, is it not written in Tehillim, Vayitosh Mishkan Shilo, that God abandoned the Mishkan in Shiloh? And it says further on, Vayimas Bol Yosef V'Shevet Ephraim Lo V'char. He rejected the Ohel Yosef. That's a reference to the Mishkan as it stood in Joseph's territory, and he no longer chose Shevet Ephraim. The pshat in, by the way, other books of the Bible is that Shiloh was smack dab in the middle of Ephraim's territory. Ephraim was the dominant tribe of Am Yisrael for the first few hundred years of their history. Ephraim produced Yehoshua ben Nun, the leader of the Jewish people. He was like the paradigm, the model for Mashiach ben Yosef. And because he was basically the king, as we've said, of the Jewish people, the capital of the Jewish people was put right in the middle of Ephraim's territory, and that's where the sanctuary was established for a few hundred years. This still continues that eventually Ephraim was rejected, so to speak, and these privileges of hosting the temple and the kingship were given to the tribe of Judah, as God had originally intended, which is why we have a Mashiach ben Yosef is supposed to show up, and eventually a Mashiach ben David, a Judean, is supposed to be the leader here. So there are other verses that say this, and by the way, I don't have it here now, but you look on generally good maps produced by proper scholars, they'll show you that the way Ephraim's territory is described in the books of Yoshua and Shoftim and Divrei Yamim, it's very clear that Ephraim's territory basically incorporates everything from a little bit north of here, starting with Beit El, until significantly north of here, until you get to the land of Menashe. And that includes the area of Shiloh. It's right there in the middle, according to most of our maps. So what is going on here? Why would Rabbi Yonasi declare that the Mishkan Shiloh stood in Binyamin's territory? I can understand Beis Olam and Beis Hamikdash. Yes, Jerusalem, actually, we're going to see this in the next section, is technically in Benjamin's territory. It's certainly Nov and Givon were also in there, assuming Nov is on a tote, by the way. If you identify Nov with the usual identifications that they give, especially when we describe the one that's endorsed by greater scholars than myself, Anatot is basically right near Jerusalem, and so is Old Givon. It's around here somewhere. So these are definitely in Binyamin's territory, but Shiloh was not. So Ravada says, "My kakashile, what's the problem, Rav Yosef? Maybe there was sort of division in Shiloh itself. There were parts that belonged to Benjamin and part that belonged to Yosef. The part where the Shekhinah was, where the sanctuary actually stood, that was in Binyamin's territory. And the place in the courtyard where the Sanhedrin sat, because there is a commandment that the Sanhedrin actually gather together when it meets, where? at the temple. And from Yeshua's time and on, when the Sanhedrin would meet, they would go to Shiloh for those purposes. It's described a few times in the Navi. That was a situation in the temple in Jerusalem. The Shekhinah, the actual temple edifice, stood in Benjamin's territory, and the Sanhedrin sat in the territory that belonged to Yehuda. The Gemara, which we don't have over here, on Daf Nun Daled in Zvachim earlier, okay, much earlier in the Masechta, actually describes this phenomenon that itself is mentioned explicitly in the book of Joshua, which is the border of Benjamin ran right across the Temple Mount. That's described. The northern border of Judah is described as running across what you and I would call the Temple Mount. And then it says the southern border of Benjamin, which was alongside that of Judah, also ran across what you and I call the Temple Mount. Jerusalem itself was a dual city. There was the lower city and the upper city, the north side and then the south side. And basically the border between the tribes went across the Temple Mount. So there's parts of the Temple Mount, mostly the eastern parts and the west. The eastern and southern area belongs to Judah, and the western and northern part belong to Binyamin. They actually show a diagram like this in the proper Gemaras that illustrate this. That's the way it was. So where the Sanhedrin sat, Lishkas Agazis, in a small piece of the Mizbeach, that was in Judah's territory, and to the west is where the actual temple stood, and that is the beginning of Binyamin's territory. And so everything to the south belongs to Binyamin. So maybe there was a similar situation going on there in Shiloh. And Rabbi Yosef responded, Amar le, Hachi Hashta. Seriously? Hasa mikarvan nachaloth gabe hadadi. When the Gemara and the sages tell us that the temple shared territory with Yehuda and Binyamin, it's because Yehuda and Binyamin, their border was actually right there. Mikarvan ha'adadi. They're right next to each other. There was a border between Judah and Benjamin. Part of Jerusalem went to this tribe, part of Jerusalem went to that tribe. So I can understand that. Hachami mikarvan. But when you're talking about Machon Shilo, the territory of Ephraim, yes, it does share a border with that of Binyamin on the south side. Shilo was nowhere near that border. Shilo was many miles, or kilometers if you want to be Israeli about this. Shilo is many kilometers north of the border between Binyamin and Ephraim. You can't start giving an answer like this. So the Gemara still insists, those who want to defend, perhaps maybe this is Rabbi Ada's response, defending Rabbi Yonassi's opinion. That's why I put it in red. Hachanami mikarvan. Yeah, maybe they were. Kedamar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, Ritzuaita yotzeit mechalkoshi udav and nechnesel chalkosha Binyamin. The way they describe it in Ritzua, others say what's it called? Rosh Tor, or a pina, an angle. Either way, it means a strip of land went out of Judah's portion into Binyamin's portion. This Ritzua of land actually went underneath the altar, and Binyamin wanted to swallow it up. He was upset that it was the situation that some of the altar was actually built on Judah's land. Binyamin wanted, just like the entire temple edifice was built on his land, the altar should be built on his land. Hachanami, here's what they're going to say. So too, a small piece of Joseph's territory came into Benjamin's. They say, no, this should be reversed. It should be some of Benjamin's territory all the way to the south miles, extended into Joseph's territory. And that's why it says in Joshua, when it's describing Shiloh, it says Ta'anat Shiloh. Now, this could be a proper noun, somehow something with related to like a suburb of Shiloh, Ta'anat Shiloh, the Ta'anah of Shiloh. But like Rashi points out, they read it as Al Shahaya Binyamin mit Onen Aleha. Binyamin was, Onen is a type of mourning. He was inconsolable. The fact that not all of the temple territory was in his territory. Okay, so that's what they see this as a reference. Somehow, Benjamin's territory extended, this Ritzua, which is they don't tell us where exactly it went, extended, I guess, up Route 60 from Jerusalem, or from the northern edge of Benjamin's territory all the way into Ephraim's territory, and that's where they built the sanctuary of Shiloh. So this obviously doesn't fit, like you said, on maps. Otherwise, where is this indicated? And then the Gemara concludes in saying that this is actually a machlokas. Rabbi Yonassi's opinion and that of Rav Yosef, who's basically saying that cannot be shot in reality, is actually reflected in a different machlokas. Over here it says a drasha on this pasuk, Chofef love. He hovers above him. Zeh mikdash rishon. That's a reference to the first temple. Benjamin hosted the first temple. Kol hayom, all day long. Zeh mikdash sheni. That's a reference to the second temple. And he dwelleth between his shoulders. That's referring to Messianic era. Why didn't it say that is referring to the third temple? Good question. I don't know. But either way, this understanding that Benjamin would host the temple, the divine presence is hovering above him all day long, is a reference to the first, second, and third temples, but not a reference to Shiloh. Okay, Shiloh preceded Mikdash Rishon. Whereas Rabbi Yudinasi has his own drasha. Rabbi Omer, Klofei Falav, he hovers above him. Zeh olam hazeh. That's this world. Or Rashi says, Kol makom shesharta shechina v'af Shilo v'no v'givon. Any place with in history where the Shechina has been, including Shilo, Nov, and Givon. Kol hayom, Elion Mashiach. That's referring to Messianic times when the temple will once again be restored. Amen. And that's referring to the next world. Interesting theological understanding. Rabbi Yonasi, he says there's this world, Yemos Mashiach, and the next world. He's saying that Yemos Mashiach is neither of this world or of the next world. He's also making a distinction between the next world and Yemos Mashiach, which we discussed in Shirim previously. Machlokas, the Rambam and Ramban, what exactly Olam Haba means. But here, we basically gave a messianic understanding. Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. Olam Hazeh includes Yemos Mashiach, and Ben Olam Hazeh, Yemos Mashiach, except Shibud Malchios. Everything will be good. But Rabbi Nasi apparently had his own way of understanding. But you see here, Rabbi Nasi felt that in this world, this reality until the Messianic era, all of the sanctuaries, at least in the classical period, stood in Benjamin's territory. So I like to say that this idea, someone reported this as as unanimous. Unanimous that the Mishkan in Shiloh stood in Binyamin's territory. But as we see here, none other than Rav Yosef was adamant that it cannot be. It's actually a machlokas tanaim. It's not a clear shot. It's actually, I think that it has the lower hand in this argument. Why? Because it's very clear from everything we know that Shiloh was in Ephraim's territory, and there was a good reason for it being in Ephraim's territory. And the Yerushalmi even gives more reasons for it being in Ephraim's territory. Let's see what the Yerushalmi says. So, Amar Rabbi Pinchas b'shem Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Eloi katuv echad omer. It says in one verse, we just saw these. Vayitosh mishkan Shilo el shekin b'adam. When God was upset at the Jewish people in the times of Eli, he abandoned the sanctuary at Shiloh, which was a tent that he had domiciled among men. God removed his presence. For a while, God said, I will allow my presence, so to speak, to be among mankind. The Jewish people earned it, but they eventually lost it, and they had to, once again, bring themselves back through repentance and earn it once again. Mashma Shaya Ohel. It's implying that the sanctuary at Shiloh was a tent, like it was when Moses built it. Another verse says that Hannah brought the young Samuel, Hannah brought her son, who was going to become Shmuel Navi, as a Levite. She had dedicated him to God's service, so she brought him to God's house in Shiloh. By the way, sometimes Beit refers to an Ohel also. Should have said Heichal Hashem. Elsewhere, a few chapters later in the same book of Samuel, it says that the Mishkan was even called a Heichal. Okay? Mashma Shaya Binyan. The implication here is that it was an actual building, not just a tent. How do you resolve these conflicting verses? The answer is given in the Mishnaic sources, like the Tosefta and the Mishnah, that at Shiloh it was a stone structure, a house of stone underneath, but it was roofless. It was the same triple layer tent as built in Moses' time, and that was what the pasuk references the Menucha, the first resting place of God's presence before the Nachalah. And as we saw, the Menucha means that this is God's temple. To what extent that would be forbidden to offer sacrifice anywhere else, but eventually it would not be God's chosen temple. It would be replaced by a permanent temple, and once that permanent temple was chosen, it is completely forbidden for Jews to ever offer sacrifice anywhere else again. Rabbi Zera Uvilvad, this is interpretation words added over here. Yud Tvachim Gvina Bayis. In order for this to have been considered an actual halachic structure, it at least had to have 10 tefachim of stone. That was permanent structure. How high is 10 tefachim? About 80 centimeters. Okay, that's less than that. It would have been considered just a base and not an actual stone structure. But apparently, these stone walls of Shiloh were actually like 10 almost tall, not just 10 tefachim. V'hatani kashem shehaya ol moed natui, and this is the hatani is actually benichusa. It's not bringing up a challenge to it. It's trying to confirm what we said here. Just like the tent of meeting was pitched. That's how you pitch a tent. You spread it out and then you tie it down with pegs on the sides. Kach ol shebeshilo natui. So too was the tent pitched in Shiloh, even though there was a stone structure. The roof was a pitched tent. So I mean, does this mean this teaching tells us that was a tent and not an actual structure, permanent structure? Amar Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Boone. Rabbi Yossi. And the name of Rabbi Boone says, he says the son of Rabbi Boone. This is Rabbi Yossi's father. Says Krasav, Krashav, Bichav, Abudav, Adanav. The way the structure of the Mishkan is put together, it had Krasim and Krashim. These are basically the boards themselves and the connecting pieces. Okay, Amudav Adanav. The Amudei Chatzer and other Amudim basically there was no doors in the original Mishkan. Basically, it was just these poles or pillars, whatever it may be, that held curtains between them, or a masach, which is a curtain that's held down also at the bottom. The difference between a curtain and a masach is that a curtain is held at the top and basically could flap at the bottom, or there's room to open at the bottom. And a masach is held on all the sides so that there's no way you could actually move it. So how did they get through the masach when they wanted to go through the pillars at the entrance of the tent, at the Olam Moed or at the Chatzer? There were pillars. You basically walked around the masach. Okay, the masach was just a screen that was there, and you had to go around the screen, but you couldn't go through the screen or part the screen. That's the description of the pieces of the Mishkan. These bolts, basically, the connecting pieces, they were seen on the inside of the Mishkan like stars in the sky at night. That is, the outer structure of the Mishkan, like we said before, in Shiloh was of stone, probably nice stone also, wasn't just any stone. But on the inside, you saw the original structure of the Mishkan, the golden boards with their connecting pieces and their silver sockets that held them at the base. That's the way it was. So this is the introduction. Rabbi Chia Rabba Amar Rabbi Shimon B'Rabbi. This is Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Nasi had a son Gamliel and a son Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Chia Rabba said to Rabbi Shimon's son, Rabbi Yudasi's son, Ani shamati me'avicha. I heard it from your father. Shekol chofod hayu shehayu lo hayu el betoch el kol Binyamin. All of God's hoverings, that is where He placed the sanctuary. When it says God hovers over Benjamin, it's poetic form, meaning He placed the sanctuary in Benjamin's territory. We're only in Benjamin's territory. That means He did not allow the sanctuary to be built elsewhere. For example, in Ephraim's territory. Matama, what's the reason for this? Uvein ktefav shachen, not chofef alav kol hayom, or something like that. It says, He shall dwell between His shoulders. God dwells, so to speak, between Benjamin's shoulders. Ba'kativ, and here's the challenge. Wait a minute. Vayimasbol Yosef v'shevet Ephraim lo v'achar. I should make this into black. Okay. This is red because this is anticipating the kasha. The kasha, anticipate kasha doesn't say that God rejected all Yosef and also rejected the tribe of Ephraim. He no longer chose it. So if you would say that this means that the sanctuary stood in Ephraim's territory, the competing opinion, the competing verse in Tehillim says, God then chose the tribe of Yehuda. That means they are the ones who were housed the sanctuary. Did God really choose Yehuda? Wait a minute. The sanctuary didn't stand in Yehuda's territory. It was in Binyamin's territory. Ela bechira uvechira. There's choices and there's choices. God selecting some people and selecting. And they make Xer Shava. Ma bechira shnemar alan Binyamin. When it says that God chose Yehuda, it means that God chose the part of Binyamin that was adjacent, shared a border with Shevet Yehuda. Binyamin bichlal, af bechira shnemar kan Binyamin bichlal. So too, when it says that God had originally chosen the tribe of Ephraim to house the sanctuary, it was really the part of Ephraim that was right adjacent to Binyamin also. That makes sense? See, it says in the verse, God chose Yehuda to house the sanctuary, but really, no, it was Binyamin. It was Binyamin, adjacent to Yehuda. So too, when God says that imply that God had chosen Yosef to house the sanctuary meant really Binyamin right next to Yosef. Okay, Binyamin adjacent to Yosef. Binyamin on the north side as opposed to Binyamin on the south side. By the way, the alternative shot, the competing shot, is that when it says that he rejected Ephraim, first it says Vaimaspol Yosef, Shuta Kamashmo. The sanctuary used to sit in Yosef's territory, Ephraim's territory, and now it didn't. Uvshevet Ephraim lo bachar, the leadership was no longer in the hands of Ephraim. Talking about leadership, Shuto Kamashmo. And when it says Vayvchar b'Shevet Yehuda, and therefore God chose Yehuda, it doesn't mean he chose Yehuda to house a sanctuary. It means that God chose Yehuda to provide the leadership. In this case, there is no kasha. See, God rejected Ephraim's leadership; they would no longer be the dominant tribe, and from now on, Yehuda would provide the kings. That's all it means. Rabbi Yonah, Rabbi Bahu b'Shem Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina says, "Urtzon shel chenisaneh." They say the pasuk also God's blessing. God's blessing through Moses at the end of the book of Devarim also says that this is the will of he who dwelleth in the thorn bush. Okay, God spoke to Moses from a burning bush, so God is considered the Shochan Yisaneh. He dwelleth in the bush. So it says in God's blessing to Joseph that this is the will of the one who dwelleth there. Okay, they said that this is a reference to the halacha that when the sanctuary stood in Shiloh, the holy foods were eaten within Joseph's territory, and they were considered as acceptable at that point. Normally, when you offer sacrifices in a sanctuary, you then have to eat the sacrificial meats within a prescribed border of that sanctuary. So Kohanim have to eat the sacrificial parts where? In the actual temple courtyard. And Jews who eat regular sacrificial meat have to at least do it within the city of Jerusalem, as we've seen before. So too, when the sanctuary stood at Shiloh, when, let's say, they ate Korban Pesach, they had to eat what? They had to eat the Korban Pesach within a prescribed territory surrounding Mishkan Shilo. And that's what we learned from over here. So this is a very strong pasuk, which shows that actually the Shiloh sanctuary stood in Joseph's territory. So Amar Ravi Avudma, the Tziporin, Rabbi Avudma of Sephra said, Kirosh Torah nichnas bikotoch shelcho shel Yosef, letoch shelcho shel Binyamin. No, somehow a part of Joseph's territory extended into, Rosh Torah in this case means a corner, into Binyamin's territory. Like they said, there are those who correct this and say, no, it should be part of Binyamin's territory extended into Joseph's territory. And that's where the altar stood in Shiloh. Mataima, what's the reason for this? This is not, when it says ad, that's not part of the pasuk over here. Once again, they're saying that this reference of Tanat Shilo, where the border going along Tanat Shilo, that's actually reference to the Shiloh we know of. And it went up until the threshold, right? The doorway of Shiloh. So somehow they're trying to say that Benjamin's territory actually approached Shiloh physically, and that's how they're able to place the Mishkan Shiloh, even though the city itself looks like it's right smack in the middle of Ephraim's territory, it was actually on Binyamin's territory. Rabbi Yonah, Rabbi Abahu, B'Shem Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina say that, what? Once again, Rabbi Yossi, that's an important name over here. No, this pasuk teaches us that the sanctuary actually appeared in this territory of Joseph. Rabbi Eliezer b'Shem Rabbi Shea, by the way, Rabbi Eliezer is shortened to Rabbi Lazer in Yiddish and in, let's say, Palestinian Aramaic of the 3rd century. Okay, there's a few Yiddishisms that are already in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Says that Rabbi Shea said, for the fact that the Mishnah says explicitly that when Shiloh stood, Kachim Kalim, that means sacrificial meats that you and I can eat if we're not Kohanim, and Meiser Sheni, that's the second tithe, says bring it to the place that God chose and eat it there. B'chol haroeh, where could they eat these sacrificial foods? B'chol haroeh. In Jerusalem, there were walls. So sacrificial food has been within the sanctified walls of Jerusalem. In Shiloh times, the sages told us that it was a little bit different. The sanctuary stood basically outside the city, a little bit to the west, and it was surrounded by the curtains as it was, not a permanent wall. And the sacrificial foods were eaten in anywhere in the surroundings that could still see the sanctuary, which is quite a large area. It's sort of in a little bit of a valley. Mishkan Shilo did not sit on top of a hill or on top of a mountain. It's actually halfway up a slope. I took a picture there. You could go see it on the Svarim blog. If you stand, let's say, just to the west of Route 60, where the Mishkan used to stand, or to the south thereof, you'll see that there's actually a bowl shape of ranges surrounding the Mishkan. So that's called the Chol HaRoach. Okay, so the fact that they used to eat all the korbanos there, lo tzarich hashoneh lazhir ala chilatan, ela ala liatan. Okay, you didn't have to tell people where to eat this. Everybody knows where to eat this. You just have to tell them, make sure to bring your sacrifices here. There was always a temptation. People fell into this temptation a lot more in the times of the kings, in the times of the first temple, they did during the times of the Shoftim, when the Mishkan was in Shiloh. We hear about that there were people who actually worshiped idols. That was pretty bad. But it wasn't such a common sin, as we described before, that people would actually offer sacrifice beyond Mishkan Shiloh. As a matter of fact, at the beginning of the Shiloh era, it was actually the biggest controversy. The people thought that the Gadites and the Reubenites and the half Menashites were going to what? Build a rival altar to the one in Shiloh. And they were threatened a civil war over such a thing. And they had to say, no, we would never consider such a terrible sin as offering sacrifice beyond God's central sanctuary. So too, the verse over here is telling you that you have to make sure that you bring your sacrifice to Shiloh, to the place that God has chosen. They had to warn people that. That's the prohibition of the Torah. There's obviously, it's hard to do otherwise, to say, you know what, because in previous times of Jewish history, I could offer a sacrifice on my own backyard altar. I could build a bama. I'll do it here. So the pasuk came to tell them, no, don't do that. There'll be times when that's permissible, but not throughout the majority of your Jewish history. But they didn't have to tell people, make sure to eat your sacrifices in the proper place. You know why? Because the proper place for eating the sacrifice extends beyond the sanctuary. A large part of Joseph's territory was sanctified for the consumption of sacrifices because that sanctuary stood in Joseph's territory. That's what this bottom line is saying over here. The bottom line in Yerushalmi, unlike the Bavli, which says whether or not the sanctuary in Shiloh stood in Ephraim's territory or Binyamin's territory, that's actually a machlokes. Okay? The bottom line in Yerushalmi is that there may have been some sages who believe that the Shiloh sanctuary stood somehow in Binyamin's territory. That doesn't seem to be the favored opinion. Otherwise, we run into halachic problems. How did they eat the korbanos there? You get into all sorts of problems. So instead, they rely on, like Rabbi Yossi. You look at a map, you see Shiloh's straight smack in the middle of Binyamin's territory. Nowhere in Sefer Yeshua is it described that somehow or other the border or a piece of land from the area of Binyamin extended so far north, a good 30 miles, to get to Shiloh, just to cover a spot big enough to house the tent of meeting and a little bit of the Azara. That doesn't seem to be shot over there. So bottom line, we shouldn't say, yes, the Mishkan Shiloh stood in the territory of Binyamin. It's actually an involved and complicated Talmudic dispute. Okay, and like I say, I think that there's one side has a stronger case in this particular case.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.